Okay, welcome everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a few more minutes to join the webinar today. We're going to be discovering Columbia Gorge and Walla Walla Valley. So just giving everyone a few more minutes to come on in. Where is everyone joining from? Joe from New York. Hey, Joe. Portland, Toronto, McMinnville. Excellent. Hey, Toronto. Hey, Dallas. Cool. Denver. Kona, nice. Scottsdale, LA. Hi, Billow. Excellent. San Francisco, Hungary. Wow, fantastic. Philly representing Rochester, Phoenix. Okay, great. I got a pretty wide audience out there today. Fantastic. Puerto Vallarta, Netherlands. Wonderful. Great. Steve Robertson is on also. Thank you, Steve. So today, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping around the chat. So we do have two representatives who have very graciously joined us from the Walla Walla Valley. We have Steve Robertson, who was one of the people who were instrumental in really forming and getting the Rocks District AVA up and running as an AVA and recognized by the TTB as an AVA. So feel free to type your questions into the chat. Please make sure that you direct the questions just to all panelists so that everyone can see, and that way everyone can see the questions coming through. And we also have fellow Master of Wine, my colleague Bilo Naravane, who is also out in the Walla Walla Valley and who has his own wine brand out there, Rasa, and also makes wine from the SJR vineyard, which is actually Steve Robertson's vineyard in the Rocks District AVA. So we do have some fantastic panelists on who are based in Walla Walla and who can really speak to that area entirely. So if you have nitty-gritty questions about the wines, the style of wines, viticulture, things like that, they will jump in and answer some questions as well. So with that said, let's jump in and get into, we're going to start with the Columbia Gorge. We're going to work west to east and finish up in Walla Walla, because I know there's probably going to be lots of questions there. So let's jump into the Columbia Gorge on our final trek around Oregon for Oregon Wine Month. Thanks for all being here. So if I can get my screen to play nice. This is the stunning Columbia River Gorge. So yes, Columbia Gorge and Walla Walla Valley are definitely absolute, audacious, and surprising, but they are also stunning. And so this is the view from Memalus Vineyard in the Columbia Gorge AVA on the Oregon side. And I just want you to take note here that you can see that on the Oregon side, there is slightly more rainfall. You can see from these, the trees that are surrounding this area, and also a lot more orchards. And so a lot more mixed farming that is happening on the Oregon side of the Columbia River Gorge, which is getting to my next point, that the area that we're dealing with today is this area right in the north of the state that buffers up against Washington. And all of these all of these regions that we're going to be talking about today are actually cross-border AVAs. So we share them with Washington because wine knows no political boundaries. And as a result of that, there's a really great culture of collaboration and sharing of information and a really tight-knit community across these river and border AVAs. So coming into the 17, 18, 19, and 20th AVAs of Oregon along that top border is what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get started. So just a reminder of where Oregon's viticulture and production is split. So the most amount of wine is grown and farmed in the Willamette Valley, which is in the north of the state, but along the coastal corridor. So sitting between two small mountain ranges, the Coast Range, which sits to the west on the Pacific Ocean, and then the Willamette Valley spreads from the foothills of the Coast Range into across the whole river valley and is buffered by the Cascade Ranges. What we're talking about today is going to be the area along the Columbia Gorge, Columbia Valley, and Walla Walla Valley, which are all to the east of the Cascade Range. So the Columbia Gorge, a world of wine in just 40 miles, and it really is a very distinctive and unique AVA in terms of how swiftly the Columbia Gorge landscape, the climate, the rainfall, the heat units and degree growing days and varieties grown change in just a 40-mile span across this quite small AVA. So it's very much volcanic viticulture with a range of diverse soils. We're going to talk about those in the creation story as well. And then there's a number of high elevation sites and microclimates. So depending on where you're located in these valleys and proximity to the river and exposure to the winds and the river systems and rainfall, it really determines what style of wine that you're going to make and what type of grape varieties you're going to grow. So this is one of the most diverse AVAs in terms of being so small, but also having the most varietal diversity. There's probably over 70 varieties that are planted in the Columbia River Gorge and just expanding because there really is a culture of experimentation and diversity here in the gorge. So they're very committed to experimentation and they have not committed to a single grape variety. So they're really having some fun out there at the moment and it's a really beautiful area to visit. Collaboration is huge across the AVA, across the borders, and most or many growers on the Oregon side will also purchase fruit from the Washington side and make different styles of wines as well. So let's get into why this area is so different and how that was created. Okay, so we all know that 200 million years ago, Oregon was under the Pacific Ocean. So the ocean really spread inland past Idaho, and this was an area that was not emerging from the ocean until 16 million years ago when the Juan de Fuca and North American plates began to connect, and the Juan de Fuca plate really subducted under the North American plate. And so what happened there was it began to form the Cascade Mountain Range inland and the Coast Range on the coast. So the Coast Range is the oldest mountain range in Oregon, and then the Cascade Mountain Range forms above the water from accumulation of a lot of volcanic activity during that time. So this was quite a long period. And this is why we say that really, you know, Oregon and Washington are basically volcanic viticulture, at least in the north of Oregon anyway. So you can see that time frame from 16 to 14 million years ago when the Cascades were being created was really this chain of volcanoes that were erupting and spewing all of this volcanic material, lava flow, all through the Columbia Valley and down the Columbia River and into the Willamette Valley. So they traveled mostly through the northern part of Oregon and Walla Walla Valley, Columbia Gorge. Then we have the Dalles Formation in the along the Columbia River. So it's not, the Dalles is actually in the Columbia Valley AVA, which is the largest AVA in Washington state, and does cover a small portion of Oregon as well. And so this is a lot of stream sediments that really started to form here and really start to layer up. So it's a pretty unique formation. You can see some of the stacks there that are forming. And so the Dalles Formation is unique to that part of the river system. After that comes the Ice Age. So 2.5 million years ago, we have a massive Ice Age. And the Cordilleran ice sheet extends quite far down. 500,000 years ago, Underwood Mountain erupts, which is on the Washington side of the Columbia Gorge AVA. And there's actually a number of vineyards that are planted along the lower slopes of the Underwood Mountain volcano to this day. And there's a number of growers in Oregon who purchase fruit from those exact vineyards. So very, very volcanic soil, lots of fine lahar volcanic sediment being grown on the vineyards there. After that, there's still a series of even more volcanoes that are erupting. So we have Mount Hood in Oregon and Mount Defiance. They continue to brew and bubble and spew lava into the air, and it actually forms like little river fissures that continue to flow down the mountainside, and the smoke and ash that comes out of these continuing volcanic eruptions are what layer into these lava stream beds, and that is where there's a lot of deep forms of lahar soil collected now in the valley, in the Columbia Gorge AVA, and along those little microclimate valleys there. 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, we have the wind-blown silt beginning to form, and we'll talk about the wind in a minute, because it really is important in this AVA and also in Washington as to how the AVA was formed. And all of this hardened basalt lava bedrock has been really grinding down these basalt bedrock soils with the Ice Age. So every time the ice moves or melts and the basalt is exposed, it's been really degraded and eroded. And so then it is free to travel in the wind. And this is one of the highest wind corridors in the state. And people come from all over the world to windsurf and kite surf in the Columbia River Valley and the Columbia River Gorge. So the winds are really important. They spread this wind-blown silt across Washington and all of the vineyards along the Columbia Valley and Columbia Gorge, and then into the northern part of the Willamette Valley. So there's two AVAs in particular that are really dominated by these wind-blown silt soils in the Willamette Valley as well. But this soil type is the weathered loess is very, very present in all of Washington viticulture and all of the northern Oregon along the river system viticulture. So then around the 18,000 to 15,000 years ago, there's the Missoula floods, which is the Cordilleran ice sheet. That massive ice sheet really starts to melt and freeze over about 50 years. There's more than 40 floods that release a massive torrent of water that comes down the Columbia River Valley. And so this is really what forms the Columbia Gorge. These big ice cubes essentially float and allow this massive wall of water to come traveling down the Columbia River Gorge and really carving out that border between Washington and Oregon very, very heavily. So they're continually widening this gorge and revealing a lot more of the basalt and lava that is underneath all of this material. And then, so from these Missoula floods, you can imagine you have these massive waters traveling down the Columbia River at very, very high speeds. And so everything that is very heavy, all of these big cobbles, all of these big boulders, there's granite erratics from the Canadian Shield, and it's all coming through, and Montana, it's all being deposited in these very fast flowing waters at the eastern edges of the Columbia River Valley and around Walla Walla as well. And so keep this in mind when we're talking about Walla Walla. All of these slack water deposits, so the finer material gets traveled further and further down the river, but all of the heavier silt material begins to settle as the waters subside. So you're getting layers and layers of these slack water silts and slack water deposits being layered on top of each other along these river valleys from Columbia Gorge out to the Walla Walla Valley and the Blue Mountains area. So the four main soil types in the Columbia Gorge are the volcanics, so the Columbia River basalts, the Cascade Mountain stream sediments from the erosion of the Cascade Mountains. So when further eruptions happen, when the ice age happens, when all of the winds, those are really starting those formations of the basalt. The Underwood Mountain lava basalt is also that volcanic bedrock as well. And then you have layered on top of those materials, the lahars, the loose, and the fast and slack water deposits. So the lahars are really on the higher foothills of the mountains in the Columbia Gorge. So on the in the vineyards, what you're getting is a bedrock of deep, rich basalt and the lahars on top of that. So the volcanic ash and silts that have been deposited on top of that, that can be anywhere from 2 feet to 10 feet deep in some areas, in some vineyards. It's very fine, nutrient poor, and very fine and silty, and so it retains water quite heavily, and it can be used for non-irrigated vineyard growing as well. That goes also for the loess. So the loess is volcanic material, but it's the degraded by the wind volcanic basalt that's been blown mostly from eastern Washington through the gorge and into the North Willamette. So these loess soils are very, very fine. They're one of the reasons why that a lot of Washington is own-rooted, because the phylloxera louse doesn't like these very fine talc powder-like soils, and they're very dense. When they get wet, they just stick to you, and so you have big chunks of these muddy, fine mud stuck to your shoes until they go dry, and then it's like talc powder falling off. It's a dust. So very good for, especially in very deep areas where the loess is very deep. It's very good for non-irrigated grape growing, and it allows, because the vine roots are so vigorous in some of these areas, it does allow those vine roots to go very, very deep into the soil to reach some of that volcanic bedrock. But the loess is nutrient poor, but also is water retaining, so very important as the climate changes as well. And then the fast and slack water deposits are primarily on the valley floors. So you tend not to find so much of these when we're talking about vineyards in the Columbia Gorge, but they are on some of the benchland vineyards that are right down by the river system there. These soils tend to be a little more vigorous. They do have some pretty high nutrient holding capacity and magnesium and iron in the soils. So they can be pretty vigorous and pretty nutrient rich, which also adds to more vigor for the vines as well. Oops. So keep that in mind, the 4 soil types and where they're primarily found along the Columbia River Gorge. And there's another beautiful image of the Columbia River Gorge. And this, I believe, is from is from the Oregon side as well. Again, you can see those trees, the Doug firs, and the forest is very much present on both sides of the town here, but of both sides of the Columbia Gorge AVA. But there is a lot of mixed farming on the Oregon side of the state as well. So established in 2004, you can see that it's a relatively small AVA. There's about 186,000 acres in total, and just under 1,000 acres are actually planted. So planted across those 4 soil types, and you can see the how many river systems have really been impacted by the Columbia River here, and what that runoff of these mountains. It's a very stunningly beautiful mountainous area. It's not just an area for wine growing. There's breweries, there's a big orchard industry, so there's a lot of cider being made as well. And then of course there's all of the play activities like the windsurfing, the mountain biking, and lots of hiking. And it's only an hour from Portland, so it does get pretty busy, but it's a really fun little area with lots of shared things to do and shared industry. So as you can see from looking at this AVA, you can see that the majority of it does sit on the Oregon side, and there are most of the vineyards and wineries are positioned on the Oregon side. So there's certainly many more, there's certainly a few on the Washington side, but the Oregon side holds the bulk of those. And then because the Oregon side is a little more mountainous and dense in terms of how high the mountains are and the elevations that you're actually able to plant at, and the heavily forested landscape, there's a lot of growers on the Oregon side that purchase from the Washington side, purchase fruit from the Washington side as well. And when we mention, a world of wine in just 40 miles, it's because we're really traveling from Hood River in the west towards the Dalles here. And as you travel from west to east, you really change the environment quite drastically. So around Hood River, you're very much looking at a similar landscape to the Coast Range and to much of the Willamette Valley. So even though we're in the Cascades and on the eastern side of the Cascades here, we still get quite a bit of rainfall that is brought down that Columbia River system and into Hood River there. And so Hood River actually sees around the same amount of rainfall in certain areas as the Willamette Valley does. And you can see that outlined right there. So around 38 to 42 inches on that very western border of the Columbia Gorge AVA, and some slightly higher elevation sites as well. But what this also means is that the grape growing is very similar to the Willamette Valley on that side of the AVA. So no irrigation used often, and also the heavy rainfall means that there's a lot more thin-skinned varieties grown. So Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Riesling, Chardonnay are all the common varieties that you're going to find on the western edge here. Of course, there's now a lot more diversity as well. So you now have a lot of Albarino and Gadeo and Arinto and other Portuguese and Spanish varieties that are really suited to some of these higher rainfall areas. So then as you start to travel to the east, you actually start to move into some very dry, warm areas. So the rainfall drops by 20 inches annually by the time you move to the east. And quick question in the chat is the rain concentrated in winter months as in the Willamette? And yes, the dominant rainfall months for the Columbia Gorge AVA and for Walla Walla as well are in the winter months. So that's when we see the most dramatic storms that deliver a ton of rain coming through. As you move east, we start to also dip out of some of the frost issues that can come with the Willamette Valley. So, you know, in the Willamette Valley, you can see frost up until the middle of May, but usually in the Columbia Gorge, on those eastern edges, you are seeing it move a little bit earlier, so into April and early May, and then as you move east to Walla Walla, it's coming even earlier in the season. The frost end is coming earlier in the season, so March, April. But great question. So yeah, really rely heavily on the winter rainfall, and that also means that they can, you know, have a pretty organic growing season there as well, without a lot of pesticide use or herbicide use from spraying, because there's not a huge amount of disease pressure since there's not a lot of rainfall during the actual growing season. And also irrigation is not required on that western edge for sure. So moving to the eastern side of the Columbia Gorge AVA, you're getting a lot more diversity in grape varieties. You start actually seeing Zinfandel and Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Menthea is grown. There's Tempranillo and a lot more warmer grape varietal success happening on the eastern side of that river gorge there. Again, because of the winds here, what you're seeing also is the grape varieties that have thicker skins and need more heat to ripen are actually thriving quite well. So the Columbia Gorge is a bit of a you know, an oddity in terms of the number of grape varieties grown in such a small area, but then also it has those delicate aromas and freshness and acidity that you get in the Willamette Valley and the Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays that are grown there. But because of the wind system which comes down the Columbia River Valley from the Pacific Ocean, it's bringing that cool wet weather system with it. But in the summertime during the growing season, it often comes from the east, and that is bringing some of the hot air from the center of the country and those warmer climates. So you can get thicker skins, but you can also get some raisioning or, you know, drying out of the fruit happening. So you have to be careful to protect your fruit here as well. And there are often a lot of hedgerows planted in the vineyards to try and protect and block some of that wind really coming down the Columbia Gorge there. What's the question? Is there any idea of dividing Columbia Gorge into sub-AVAs given the great climatic differences? I don't think there has been at the moment, because there's just not enough producers in the AVA yet. And also it really does give the producers in the region the ability to purchase fruit from every part of the AVA. And so they have this really wide variety of styles and varieties that they can actually work with and share with their, you know, consumers and the trade. So I think for now, the Columbia Gorge will actually kind of hang pretty tightly onto that diversity and the idea that this, you know, region is unique because they can purchase from all over the place. And also for that reason, we're seeing a lot of smaller producers who don't have vineyards of their own yet, who are purchasing fruit from established growers. There's a lot more growers here that don't have actual vineyards or wine brands attached to their vineyard estate. So less estate production and more sharing and purchasing of fruit to really build that complexity into the AVA itself. So pretty unique little region. So I don't think at the moment there'll be any talk of carving it up any further, but good question. So moving into the Walla Walla area now, once we've traveled from, I'm just going to go back to this temperature image. So once we've traveled out of the Columbia Gorge, we actually drop into the Columbia Valley AVA, which is, as I mentioned earlier, Washington's largest AVA. But it does cross into the border into Oregon just for this section. So around the Dalles, the town of the Dalles, and as it moves toward Walla Walla, any vineyards that are grown there are really Columbia Valley designate AVAs. And so there as you can see from the low precipitation in the area, you're really starting to get into those more traditional Washington grape varieties. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Sauvignon Blanc, some Riesling because it is late ripening and likes the heat as well. But you're really also needing irrigation in these areas as well. So that's something that's a little more unique about moving into that Columbia Valley AVA area and then moving into Walla Walla. So Walla Walla changes quite dramatically as well. But the Columbia Gorge AVA, really fun for being able to really explore a world of wine in just that short little area. And you know, the eastern edge of the AVA does really do, you know, higher alcohol, riper fruited styles of wine than compared to the eastern side of the AVA as well. And definitely moving into a lot more varietal diversity in terms of what you can grow in a warm climate as well. So image of Blue Mountain Estate Vineyard in the Walla Walla Valley, and you can see that it really is rolling hills and is, you know, has a very long history of agriculture in this AVA. And in you know, in the 1850s, there was vineyards planted out here, but the industry has a lot of wheat farms as well, and people who have diversified their farming practices or growing practices over the decades to establish vineyards instead of wheat. There's also the famous Walla Walla onions, of course, and then the Blue Mountains is the mountain range that spreads into Idaho, where they're sharing an AVA as well with Idaho. So Walla Walla Valley was the first cross-border AVA in the US. It is unique in that it has mostly own-rooted vines. Most of Washington state, of course, has own-rooted vines because, as I mentioned earlier, that loess soil, the phylloxera louse really does not like and often cannot survive in. It's also very dry, and there's also very cold winters, so you get a lot of pest die-off during the winter months here as well. So phylloxera-free area, and again, volcanic viticulture being that mostly basalt bedrock with layers and layers of loess soils across as well. There's also very large diurnal temperature shifts here because you are so far from the Pacific Ocean, and you're not getting as much of that wind influence and storm influence making it down to the valley's end here. But the Blue Mountains themselves do create their own sort of microclimate, and so there's a lot of actual airflow and wind movement and higher rainfall, dramatically higher rainfall as you head towards the eastern end of the Walla Walla Valley AVA and into the Blue Mountains as well. It's primarily Bordeaux and Rhone varieties, and mostly red grape varieties are grown out here. And the Rocks District of Milton Freewater, which became its own AVA in 2015, is not only the smallest AVA in the US, but it's also the only AVA that's based around a single soil series. So those Milton Freewater cobbles are what the AVA is actually based around there. So very similar history, you know, in terms of the geology of the area as the Columbia Gorge AVA. However, it does alter a bit, and you can see that the Walla Walla River is the main river in town that runs through and dissects the AVA. But there's also a number of other rivers that flow through the AVA as well, and as such, there's a lot of riverbed and alluvial growing happening in Walla Walla, and there, for quite a small region, there's actually a lot of diversity in terms of the vineyard sites and what soil type are in which vineyard sites, depending on whether you're a valley floor or hillside location as well. So the Missoula floods caused a lot of slack and fast water deposits that really backed up in the Columbia River and forced all of these deposits down these little river systems. So they all came backed up in the Wallula Gap and really delivered a lot of those sediments into these river valleys in the Walla Walla area. Then there's also the gravels that were deposited in alluvial fans, again, through the flow of the Walla Walla River, and where these slack water deposits got built up and actually started slowing down. So when the floods were coming through, where did the slack waters end up sitting, and where did those deposits settle? And that's what's the unique part of the rocks district of Milton Freewater, is that there was a very large deposit of these basalt rocks in that very small area, so an alluvial fan area. What's the question? Okay, so when was the Missoula flood and where did it originate from? So the Missoula flood were 16,000 years ago, and they covered a series of years, so 16 to 14,000 years ago, and that was a series of more than 40 floods, 40 to 50 floods over many decades. So it came from the Cordilleran ice sheet, which was formed during the Ice Age, and the actual floods themselves, they started coming from Missoula, Montana. So if you started in Montana, in Missoula, you could actually follow the path of the floods where that big ice dam was sitting and began to thaw. And as it thawed, it's like an ice cube in your drink. It rises up a little bit, and as it thaws out, and it releases these massive floods that come through. So those floods came all the way from Montana through Idaho and into Washington, and then finally Oregon as well. So covering a very large area, and for, again, many years, and at least more than 40 floods occurred. And then again, wind-blown silt into the Walla Walla Valley after the Ice Age. So all of that basalt that was exposed after the ice melted and the floods had dissipated was blown with the very strong winds that blow up and down the Columbia River Valley. And so these were deposited on the southwest facing slopes of the Blue Mountains and the Walla Walla Valley. So we basically have 3 soil series here, but in reality, there's more like 4 soil series for the Walla Walla Valley. So we have the basalt bedrock, number 1, which is really depending on how deep the loess is, or the slack water sediments are on top of the basalt, is really dependent on where you're going to see that basalt coming through. So the basalt cobbles are also then mostly, again, in those river valleys that are really positioned in those old river systems. So the most of those basalt cobbles are around that very small AVA of Milton free water, which is why there is now a AVA surrounding those very unique basalt cobbles. It's a very dense collection of those basalt cobbles. And then the Missoula flood slack water sediments are pretty much really layered over most of the low hillsides and generally up to around 1,100 feet in elevation, with the loess on top of them. So depending on how deep the loess soil is, you know, that's where you're getting the different complexity coming from, which is why there can be such a focus in the Walla Walla Valley area on just a few grape varieties. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Syrah and Grenache, some of the Rhone varieties, but they can have very different expressions depending on where they're being grown in the AVA. So if they are on the valley floors with more of the Missoula flood sediments, they're going to have much more free draining soil. If they're on the southwest hillsides, then there is also going to be a lot more, you know, loess that the vines can go through to try to hit into that bedrock as well. Okay, we've got some chat going on. The floods were the second largest release of energy on planet Earth. I love that. That's great, Steve. Thank you. The floods were massive and very, very important, but the geography and geology here in Walla Walla is quite unique in terms of how it really presents itself across this valley. So you can see that the Walla Walla River is that major river system. So if you're some of the vineyards that are planted along this valley floor area with the overlying Missoula flood sediments, like Pepper Bridge and some of the Seven Hills vineyards, you're going to have a lot more of this Missoula flood sediment and alluvials and very free draining into your vineyards and the wine that you're growing from there. And then the other soil type that has more access to the bedrock is the basalt bedrock with the overblown loess on top. And so that's mostly on the southwest foothills, but in some places it can be, you know, up to 10 feet in depth to get through. So it's quite powdery, quite fine. It can retain a lot of moisture. And even in some of those vineyards, you don't need to irrigate. So generally out in Washington, you need to irrigate your vines. But in the Walla Walla AVA, it can be quite unique in that irrigation isn't always required because of the difference between rainfall and the different soil series that the vineyards are being grown on. So the Blue Mountains, you can see to the eastern side of the Walla Walla AVA, have really a lot of rainfall. Billo, Steve, correct me, but there's almost double the amount of rainfall in the Blue Mountain side than there is on the western side of the Walla Walla AVA. Is that correct? Okay, good, excellent. And so we get a lot of diversity growing here, and diversity in terms of the style of wines that are being grown. So you can have a lot more earlier picked, fresher styles or more herbaceous styles being grown on the eastern edge of the Walla Walla Valley AVA. On the western side, there is a lot more of those riper styles that often don't have, you know, that can have a lot of rotundone in Syrah. There's a lot of sun exposure, and the western side can be more of those more robust structured styles, and really getting a lot more cool weather styles on the eastern side of the Walla Walla AVA. So the basalt soils are actually pretty dense, and so you can have some really quite strong structural flavors coming through, iron flavors, some ferrous notes coming through on those basalt soils. The loess soils are actually pretty fine, and so what you get with that is water retention, but then you also get some really nice fine-grained tannins coming from this slow release of water and ripening happening over the course of the growing season. Of course, having the ability to water your grapes, when they need it, also allows you to have a lot of control over the alcohol levels and ripening levels, and really, making sure that these ripeness levels come all the way through to the end of the season. However, there are winter freezes that can happen in Walla Walla. So one of the viticultural hazards is that you're often getting to the end of the season and hoping that you don't get frosted. So they can have some very early frosts in the fall, in early October, and that's really when they're waiting to perfectly pick these red varieties that they're going to make pretty structured, long, age-worthy styles out of. More calcium carbonate and magnesium in those wines as well. Oh, available in those soils. Can they make ice wine in some years? Possibly. I'm not sure if that's Billo or Steve. Have you ever seen ice wine come out of Walla Walla? Maybe Leonetti made some in one year, occasionally. Yeah. So Billo actually works across Idaho and Walla Walla, Eastern Washington as well. So he definitely knows all of the styles that are coming out. I would imagine, oh, some have made some ice wine with Syrah. That's crazy. Cool. What about sparkling Syrah? any of that coming out? So let's move into so the other thing that, this is the breakdown of the grape varieties. So mostly Cabernet Sauvignon here, but Syrah is increasing massively. So last year, I think in the last census, the Walla Walla Valley had the most increase in plantings of Syrah of anywhere in Oregon. So there really is a very unique style of Syrah being grown in the Walla Walla Valley. What I love about, the Bordeaux varieties here is that they generally don't have a lot of herbaceousness to them. So like, because we are a lot further north here, we get a lot longer daylight hours. So you can see on this slide, the maximum number of daylight hours that they get during the growing season. That average is around 13 and a half daylight hours during the growing season. So that's an hour and a half more than Napa Valley. And so you don't get a lot of these herbaceous characters coming through in the wines. You get really lovely ripe tannin profiles as well, and pretty high alcohols as well. Then also the west side of the AVA has a lot more rainfall, so 22 inches compared to 7. But they also have the most sunshine days. I think there's about 300 sunshine days a year in Walla Walla. It's pretty amazing. And again, that wind system that buffers up against the Blue Mountains and blows down the Blue Mountains helps to cool the vineyards on that eastern side, which helps to allow for a slowing down of the alcohol accumulation or the sugar accumulation. So there's a lot of more detailed, fresher styles being made on that eastern side, and then moving into the Milton Freewater cobbles as well. So the beauty of the cobbles, and you can see how green and lush and beautiful it is out in Walla Walla as well. So and this is a vineyard that looks like it doesn't have any irrigation as well here. But irrigation is really important generally on this on the eastern side of the Cascades. So being able to dial in your irrigation means that you don't have to do a lot of tractor passes, you don't have to do a lot of spraying in the fields. It can be a really, you know, minimal farming area, which is nice to have. And then this is the SJR vineyard in the Rocks district. So moving into the Milton Free Water AVA, which was created in 2015 by Kevin Pogue, who's a geologist out in Washington State, and Stephen worked with very closely to get the creation of this AVA. And you can see very clearly all of these cobbles here that are quite deep into the soil here. So the grapevines here, I spent a really lovely day out in the vineyards with Steve's daughter, Brooke, who is a viticulturist out in this vineyard, but also many other vineyards, but explaining, you know, how deep the vine roots can go into these very fine silty soils, but the very deep cobbles, how deep they are, actually allow the vine roots to go very, very deep. And the beauty of these soils in this AVA is that the cobbles allow the vine roots to warm up earlier in the season, so they get a longer, more reliable growing season than in some of the other parts of the AVA. And it's what creates the uniqueness of the AVA along with the cobbles. But it's the fact that the vineyard ripens more consistently and also earlier in the season. And another advantage of having those rocky cobbles and that very, very dark soil is that the sun really heats up the soil and is absorbed by those rocks and by that warm soil. And you can see that Brooke trains the vines quite low here so that those that fruiting wire can really, you know, the grapes can hang off that fruiting wire and can really benefit from the reflected warmth that comes off of those warm stones and very black soils there. So very nutrient rich soils, a lot of magnesium, calcium, iron, which really show through in the wines. And the wines are incredibly unique, especially on varieties that have a little more transparency or don't necessarily have a lot of oak impact. You know, there's a lot more earthiness that comes through. There's a lot more meatiness, really, really flavorful leather and jerky and herb characters and a lot of earthy character. The cobbles, yeah, act as a radiator. Yeah, Walla Walla is mostly harvested by hand. In fact, most of Oregon is harvested by hand in general, but these vineyards are quite small out here as well. It's not like the rest of Washington State in that there are these very big plots of land that are you know, mostly on the valley floors that can be machine harvested. There's a very strong community, agricultural community out here that hand harvests as well and does all the work during the growing season. So the, you know, the diversity of the vineyard slopes and vineyard aspect here in Walla Walla allow for or require the need for hand harvesting the majority of the time as well. And there is a lot of, you know, hand work that needs to be done in the vineyard when you're dealing with a lot of different red grape varieties. And you need to, you know, shade some of the fruit so that you're not getting a lot of sun put on the fruit to burn them, or that will cause problem during the growing season. And Steve said, yeah, the parcels in the rocks are mostly under 10 acres. Yeah, this is one of the smallest AVAs. And I think last time I was there was maybe 4 vineyards or 4 wineries. How many vineyards are there in the Rocks district now, Steve? And Biller, how many wine brands are there that are coming from the Rocks district as well? I know this takes some time to type, so I'm going to keep talking while they're typing out the answers to my questions there. But it's a pretty exciting little AVA, and as is the rest of Walla Walla. I think there might be, you know, in the future there, as more people come through planting into the Blue Mountains as well, there may be more need for developing an AVA that is on that eastern side, because the rainfall is really so different over there. And you know, in Walla Walla, there is a lot more estate planting and estate grown conversation than in the Columbia Gorge. So there's 50 vineyards, 5 wineries have a physical presence in the AVA, but there's 48 wineries sourcing fruit from the Rocks District, which is kind of insane. That's amazing. Also in the area, this is something that you're going to, you know, if there are more wineries created in the Rocks District or on the smaller side of the AVA, which is in Oregon, you can see from the map here that most of the Walla Walla AVA is in Washington. The town of Walla Walla actually has most of the wineries and most of the around the winery presence there. And so that's why you see more Walla Walla, Washington wines than you see Walla Walla, Oregon wines, because unfortunately with Oregon and its labeling laws, once you cross the border into Washington and make the wine over in Washington, the wine is only capable of having an Oregon designate put on its label. And I'm not sure if that is going to change anytime soon. I continually hear talk of it, but it would be, you know, it would be a great opportunity to expand that Oregon Walla Walla conversation and the Milton free water conversation. But the region is still fairly small, and so while there is some presence in a lot of restaurants, there's you know, there's a lot of restaurants around the nation. There's really not a huge retail presence for a lot of these wines from Walla Walla, and they do have a very strong consumer demand coming from Portland and Seattle as well. Is Velcorin a good way to protect the Finnish wines? I guess it's a good way to protect the Finnish wines from Brettanomyces, if that's something that you want to add to your wine. I'm not aware of a lot of wineries doing that, but Billo would be able to answer that question better than I could. So Billo, yeah, most wineries do not use it. And a lot of wineries, you know, are really protective of their people and their staff, and so Velcorin can be a little tricky to work with in the cellar. Yeah, it's Google Velcorin. It's a different conversation, but again, most of the small producers don't use Velcorin to remove Brettanomyces or protect the wine from Brettanomyces. Even though, you know, the pH of the wines here can be quite high, and the ripeness quite high at, you know, picking between 24 and 28 bricks. The fleshiness, there's an earthiness, and the tannin structure to these wines really does balance out that riper fruit and some of the freshness. Yeah, I can't say that, dimethyl dicarbonate. DMDC. So Google Velcorin if you're interested, and be prepared to be surprised about what can go into wine, which is also another conversation for ingredient labeling in wine if you really want to get down to that. What I'm excited about seeing coming from the Rocks District of Milton free water is the expansion of the actual varieties that are grown here. So Syrah and Grenache primarily. There is Cabernet and Merlot as well, but the Rocks District does have such a distinctive flavor profile coming from the soils here that it is one of the most exciting little AVAs that I have seen and in recent years, and it's pretty exciting that there's more people purchasing fruit from it and trying to use it as an AVA designate. Because it is quite small, you're going to find much more distinctiveness of Syrah coming from and Cabernet and Grenache coming from these soils here. Low but balanced diet of micronutrients, which triggers vines to focus on ripening fruit, resulting in a broader range of flavors. There's a depth of flavor. Yeah, Steve, I agree. There's a depth of flavor to these wines that you don't often find in Syrah. So it's quite a complex grape growing area, and I think there's going to be a lot more attention paid to it as we continue to grow. And Walla Walla in general continues to expand. So there's a lot of farmers that are starting to leave other or diversify their farming or agricultural production. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot more growth in the Walla Walla area and also in the Rocks District AVA. Any other questions coming through? Have I missed any, Margaret? You've been pretty good at getting them all through to me. Steve and Billo, thank you for being on the call and answering questions in the chat as they come through. To really experience, any wine region, it's really, a benefit if you can visit there. But also the Walla Walla AVA website has a lot of information on it, and so does the Milton Freewater Rocks District website. Has a lot of information, a lot of imagery that really takes you to the place. But again, you can't really feel the dryness of the air or where the breeze hits you in the vineyard, and just how ripe that fruit gets. From these beautiful cobbles and from the clear blue skies until you actually go and visit. So while everyone's traveling locally or doing small local visits within the US, put Walla Walla on your stop as well. Yeah, I mean that. So yeah, there's a couple of questions coming through now. Thanks, Katie. I appreciate that comment. Billo, having worked with so many different vineyards in Walla Walla and Idaho and the Rocks District, really has a great understanding of the uniqueness that the potassium and magnesium and nitrogen in the soils here, the richness of nutrients in the soils in the Rocks District, really add to the unique flavor profile and aroma profile of the wines, and especially the Syrahs that come out of the Rocks District. And I couldn't agree more. It's incredibly distinctive, and I think there's going to be a lot more attention paid to some of that nutrient conversation and how the vines work with nutrients in the soil to create really distinctive fruit profiles. It's a fascinating area to go and taste through. And Carter, I'm sorry, we did talk about the AVA labeling requirements, the practices in terms of, Oregon not being able to label the wines as the Rocks District or as Walla Walla if it's made in Washington. But yeah, please watch the recording. It wasn't that far ago, so you'll be able to skip through. And thanks, Tom, for putting in that great website as well. And thank you, everyone. And go out and buy some Walla Walla and Rocks District Syrah and Cabernet, and really get familiar with some of the flavor profiles and the conversations that we've been talking about, because you really can see the terroir and the place in these wines and in these wine styles. And the winemakers and viticulturists here are very minimalist in their approaches and really like to show the transparency of the place place. They work very hard, and it's a very unique area to be able to walk through and taste through. Thanks to everyone for joining our series of Oregon Wine Month webinars, and come back next year when we do them again. And I think next year we might have some winemakers on the panel, so we can really, you know, have them engaging and chatting with us as well. So for now, share these webinars with your friends, with your colleagues, and then pop back and see us next year. Cheers, everyone. Thanks for joining us.